The Scorpion Gate was secured, and the full weight of the Achaemenid invasion force now stood poised at the border of the Sinai Peninsula. The strategic landscape had changed. The war was no longer about walls, but about logistics and morale across the vast, inhospitable desert. General Artabanus, master of the invisible siege, faced his greatest challenge yet. The Sinai was a siege in itself, 100 miles of shifting sand, hostile tribes, and dangerously scarce water. If Artabanus were to rely on traditional attrition, the desert would claim his army before the Nile ever did. He needed to make the Sinai invisible to negate its lethality as a defense. His strategy for the crossing was a logistical masterpiece built on intelligence and foresight. He utilized the detailed maps and local knowledge extracted from the captured Egyptian garrison's logistics officers. Artabanus focused on securing every single known watering hole, not to hoard the water, but to control the information about its safety and availability. Small, highly mobile Persian engineering teams moved ahead of the main army, marking freshwater caches and critically poisoning the brackish or shallow wells often used by desperate travelers. The psychological goal was clear: to ensure that any desperate straggler or retreating Egyptian scout who attempted to use the desert for cover would find only fear, sickness, or death, reinforcing the narrative of an unstoppable, cursed Persian advance. Meanwhile, in the Nile Delta, the disgraced governor Nephthotep arrived at the royal capital of Memphis. She was stripped of her title. Yet she brought the one thing the pharaoh's court desperately lacked: first-hand knowledge of the new Persian threat. The court was initially dismissive, viewing the Scorpion Gate's fall as simple treason or incompetence. They prepared for a conventional battle of chariots and spears, Nephthotep countered, stating Artabanus fights not with the sword, but with doubt. He will not seek our strong points. We'll seek the fractures in our trust. She argued passionately that their vast, complicated civilization, from the superstitious priesthood to the financially motivated Greek ship captains, was a network of vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. Against the court's objections, she was reluctantly given command of the Delta Regional Defense, a sprawling responsibility meant to keep her far from the capital, but granting her the necessary operational freedom. Nephthotep immediately abandoned the traditional strategy of defending the outer fortifications. She understood that walls merely concentrated the target Artabanus desired. Her new doctrine was the adaptable defense: sacrifice the periphery to protect the core. Prioritize speed and decentralization over static strength, and turn every logistical nightmare Artabanus faced back upon him. She began a ruthless campaign of counterintelligence and purification. All external messengers and merchants were quarantined and interrogated. Suspicion became the primary tool of command. Nephthotep also ordered the deployment of local militia along every channel of the Delta, not to fight, but to monitor. Needed to know where and how Artabanus would try to cross the Nile. As Artabanus's army pushed through the Sinai, faced the crucial hurdle of the Suez marshlands, the water barrier that separated the desert from the Nile proper, his solution was a stroke of logistical genius rooted in psychological warfare. He had brought with him the Greek mercenary captain, who had betrayed the Scorpion Gate. The captain was now Artabanus's lead engineering consultant, tasked with rapidly constructing a series of temporary bridges and causeways across the marshes. This move served three purposes. It utilized essential engineering expertise. It publicly rewarded treason, sending a chilling message to any loyal Egyptian commander, and it used up the liability that was the mutinous Greek. The Persian advance was relentless, but the final natural defense of Egypt was the Nile River itself, vast, wide, and entirely controlled by the powerful Egyptian naval fleet. Artabanus knew a river crossing would expose his land forces to devastating counterattack. He needed a fleet, and the Achaemenid navy was still months away. This required a third phase of the invisible siege, targeting the source of Egyptian confidence: the priesthood. Artabanus focused on the local priests near the Delta's eastern entrance. These men wielded immense power over the local population's morale and loyalty. He deployed agents who did not offer bribes, but who subtly introduced disturbing new omens and interpretations of ancient prophecy. The agents spoke of the water curse that felled the Scorpion Gate, suggesting the pharaoh's failure to appease the desert gods had brought a pestilence that could not be fought with iron. The priests, already anxious about the speed of the Persian advance, began publicly performing complex, demanding rituals to cleanse the river water, inadvertently causing delays and confusion in civilian support for the military. This was the psychological application of the toxin, a non-physical poison injected directly into the cultural certainty of the Egyptian people. Neithotep intercepted reports of this spiritual panic. She realized the enemy was using the fear from the Scorpion Gate as an active deployed weapon. She counterattacked by arresting the most vocal priests under charges of sedition and ritual incompetence, replacing them with military-appointed loyalists. It was a harsh move that bought her time at the cost of public goodwill. The real confrontation now approached the Nile crossing. Artabanus's engineers constructed massive pontoons disguised as civilian barges on the eastern bank. Neithotep, having monitored the Persians' supply movements, correctly predicted the crossing point would be the narrowest, most concealed section of the river, favored by traders. She did not deploy her main war fleet. Instead, she mobilized hundreds of small, fast, highly maneuverable Delta River cutters, vessels too numerous and shallow to be easily targeted by massive warships. Her goal was not annihilation, but denial. She wanted to force Artabanus into a conventional kinetic battle on the water, where she held the immediate advantage. Artabanus, impatient after the weeks-long crossing of the Sinai, ordered the immediate deployment of the pontoon bridge at midnight. The night was chosen to mask the effort, but the sound of hammers-on would echo across the still water. Neithotep's small cutters, hidden in the reeds, descended on the crossing point in 3 waves, not attacking the soldiers, but targeting the pontoon anchors and ropes. The Persians found themselves fighting a naval battle not against massive war galleys, but against thousands of small, agile, stinging insects. The chaos was immediate. The pontoon bridge buckled, sending hundreds of Persian soldiers plunging into the cold, fast-moving current. Artabanus's forces were caught in the act of deploying, an overwhelming land force rendered helpless by a swarm of small boats in the aquatic environment. The element of surprise, Artabanus's specialty, was entirely lost. Neithotep had successfully turned the Nile's complexity into an active defense. However, Artabanus had anticipated a disruption. He had deployed a corps of his elite Persian infantry on large, slow, heavily armored rice barges further downriver. While the main crossing was in chaos, these heavily protected barges secured a crucial, small beachhead on the western bank, the gateway to the delta. Neithotep's cutters had won the engagement, but Artabanus had won the objective. He had a foothold in Egypt. The battle of the river crossing ended at dawn. The pontoon bridge was destroyed. Hundreds of Persian troops were lost to the Nile, and the main Persian advance was stalled. But Artabanus stood on Egyptian soil, having achieved the seemingly impossible, crossing the natural barrier. Neithotep surveyed the damage from her command post. She had demonstrated that the Persian general was fallible when forced into open conventional combat, yet the price was high. The presence of the Persian troops on the western bank solidified the local panic initiated by the priest's omens. The morale of the Egyptian people, already fractured by the Scorpion Gate's fall and the fear of the water curse, began to break. Artabanus, now entrenched, ordered a halt to the main advance. He would not commit his full force until the internal situation in Egypt was ripe. He used the beachhead as a showcase of Persian might and unconventional mercy. He ordered his troops to pay exorbitant prices for local Egyptian supplies, feeding the local population, contrasting sharply with the pharaoh's heavy taxes. This tactic was the final phase of the invisible siege, turning the civilian population into a passive, eventually active ally, through economic incentive and perceived kindness. The Persian general had exchanged a swift military victory for a slow, inevitable political collapse. Neithotep, now facing her enemy across a few miles of fertile farmland, knew the time for maneuvering was over. Her adaptable defense had stemmed the tide, but the economic and psychological siege was tightening around Memphis. She still commanded the loyalty of the army, but the loyalty of the people was dissolving into gold and fear. The stage was set for the final confrontation, a battle that would decide not just the fate of the city, but the fate of the entire ancient world. The war had boiled down to a single question. Could Egyptian loyalty endure a siege waged against the very heart of its civilization? Artabanus's headquarters, established on the riverbank, became a center of complex intelligence gathering. He monitored the price of grain, the attendance at temples, and the deployment of the pharaoh's personal guard. Understood that Memphis was the Scorpion Gate on a massive scale, defended by layers of bureaucracy and tradition, ripe for internal collapse. He began a final, meticulous campaign of targeted assassination, not of military officers, but of the pharaoh's tax collectors, effectively halting the government's cash flow and creating a popular uprising against the regime. This move was designed to force the pharaoh's hand, to make him choose between fighting the Persians outside or fighting his own starving people inside the capital. Nefertep knew this final move was coming. She prepared her loyal troops for a defensive line outside Memphis, hoping to draw Artabanus into one final conventional trap. She knew she could not defeat the invisible siege, but she might be able to defeat the visible army it was designed to protect. The two commanders, representing the ancient world's most sophisticated military minds, were now locked in a deadly final engagement. Artabanus had the psychological edge, the foothold, and the overwhelming reserves of the Achaemenid Empire. Nefertep had the terrain, the river navy, and the fierce, protective loyalty of her Egyptian core guard. The final battle was inevitable, but Artabanus was determined to ensure it was merely a formal conclusion to a conflict already won through psychological and logistical dominance. The scent of civil unrest and the distant murmur of the Persian camp hung heavy over Memphis. The capital, the symbol of ancient power, was surrounded, not by battering rams and catapults, but by doubt, disease, and economic collapse. The invisible siege was about to claim its final, greatest prize. Part 2 concludes here, with Artabanus entrenched on the Nile, Nefertep preparing for the last stand, and the Egyptian state on the verge of fracturing. The war for the Nile was poised on a knife edge. The conflict's strategic and psychological turning points captured your imagination. Please let me know your thoughts on Nefertep's adaptable defense in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe to Storycraft Studio to ensure you don't miss Part 3, The Fall of Memphis.